The tide had been going out for 3 hours when Nadia first noticed the light. She wasn't looking for anything. That was the thing about Seaburn in November. Nobody came here looking for anything. You came because the bus route ended here, or because your dog needed running, or because the grey of the sea matched the grey inside your chest, and it felt honest in a way the rest of the world didn't. Nadia came because her shift at the care home didn't start until 4, and the flat smelled like her ex-husband, and she couldn't afford to heat both rooms. The light sat on the water about 200 meters out, not moving, not blinking, just sitting there like a buoy that had learned to glow from the inside. She watched it for a while. Then she sat down on the cold concrete of the promenade wall and kept watching, because she had nowhere else to be, and because something in the back of her skull, something old and animal and very quiet, told her that looking away would be the wrong choice. Kenji found her there 20 minutes later. He was Japanese-British, 53, retired merchant navy, and he walked the beach every morning because his physio had told him to, and his physio was the only person he consistently listened to. He had a thermos of tea. He had a waterproof jacket the color of old mustard. He had the specific, unhurried competence of a man who had spent 30 years on vessels in bad weather and had decided that panic was a resource like any other, to be spent carefully. He sat down next to her without asking if the space was taken. "That's not a buoy," he said. "No," she agreed. "Been there long?" 20-something minutes when you arrived." He poured tea into the thermos cap and offered it to her. She took it. Neither of them said anything for a while. The light pulsed once, not a flash, more like a breath, and then the object beneath it began to move toward the shore. It was smaller than Nadia had imagined. That was the first surprise. Everything in her lifetime of science fiction had prepared her for something vast, something that would block the sky and cast the whole coast into shadow. What came in on the tide instead was roughly the size of a transit van, matte black and geometrically wrong in a way that made her eyes slide off its angles, trailing something that looked like steam, but wasn't. It didn't crash. It arrived. There was a difference, and it mattered. The third person was a man named George, who had been asleep in his camper van in the seafront car park, and woke up because something had interfered with the electromagnetic field in a 15-meter radius, and his phone alarm had begun screaming 12 different ringtones simultaneously. He was 61, large, pink-faced, a former electrical engineer from Gateshead who was driving to his daughter's wedding in Edinburgh and had stopped here because he miscalculated the distance. He came stumbling across the sand with his reading glasses still on and the wrong shoes and a travel mug that said "World's Okayest Granddad," and he stood next to Nadia and Kenji, and the three of them watched the thing settle itself on the wet sand at the waterline. A seam opened in it. Light came out, not threatening light, just light, the color of early morning through cheap curtains, and then came Zorion. Later, much later, when people asked Nadia to describe it, she always started with the same thing. It was paying attention, not to her specifically, to everything. To the sand, the concrete, the rusted metal of the old fairground frame further up the beach, the graffiti on the seawall, Kenji's thermos, George's mug, the specific wrinkle pattern of her care home uniform trousers. Its sensory apparatus, she never called them eyes, because they weren't quite eyes, moved across the world with the focused, cataloging intensity of something that had been trained to read meaning into surfaces. It was reading them, all of it. Every object on that beach was a text. The chaos started small. George's travel mug lifted off his hand and rotated slowly in the air 3 feet in front of his face. He didn't reach for it. He stood very still and watched it turn, and when it set itself back in his palm, he said quietly, "Right then." The graffiti on the seawall rearranged itself. The letters didn't move so much as shimmer and reform. The original tags becoming something that Nadia's brain kept insisting was almost words in a language she had never learned, but felt like she should have. The feeling lasted about 4 seconds, and then the graffiti went back to being graffiti, but her skull ached as if she'd tried to remember something enormous. Kenji's thermos unscrewed itself. The tea poured upward in a smooth arc and held in the air, perfectly spherical, steaming gently. Then it fell, and the thermos caught it, and Kenji said nothing, just screwed the lid back on. Nadia understood then what was happening, not all of it. She wouldn't understand all of it for another 2 hours. But the core of it settled into her with the particular clarity of a thing that's obvious once you see it. It was testing cause and effect. It was watching to see what they valued. She took a breath. She took another. Then she reached into her bag and found what she always carried in the front pocket for bad shifts, a folded photograph, laminated because she'd laminated it years ago when it started to crease, of her mother and herself at a fun fair somewhere on this same coast 20 years ago. Her mother was laughing. Nadia was 13 and pretending not to enjoy herself. The fun fair was long gone. She held it out, not toward Zorion, not as an offering, just held it, the way you might show someone something if you wanted them to understand what you were pointing at. The sensory apparatus turned toward it. The air pressure changed. Not dramatically, just enough that her ears popped once, like descending in a plane. And she understood, with a certainty she couldn't explain, that Zorion had just encountered its first problem. It could read everything on that beach. Every surface, every material, every electromagnetic signature. It had been doing this. She understood it all later, when the researchers came, and she tried to describe it. To every location it had visited on its survey of this world. It worked by reading what a species constructed, and therefore what they valued, and what they valued told it what they were, and what they were told it whether they were a threat or a resource or something else entirely. The problem was the photograph. Specifically, what was on the photograph was no longer in the world. The fun fair was gone. The laughing woman was dead. The 13-year-old was standing here on this cold beach in her work clothes 37 years later, and the thing that made the photograph precious was not any property of the photograph itself, but the relationship between the object and a set of events and emotional states that existed now only in one human nervous system. Zorion couldn't read that. It had never encountered a species that stored meaning outside of reality, in the gap between the object and the memory of the object. It had spent, Nadia's best guess later was several hundred years, surveying worlds, and every species it had encountered stored value in things. In structures, in territory, in biological markers, in resource hoards. Even the most sophisticated ones it had logged stored their cultural memory in durable physical objects. Monuments, data structures, genetic archives. Humans stored theirs in the space between things. In the look on a face, in the reason a particular song was unbearable for 6 months after someone left, in why a specific mug mattered and not the identical mug next to it. In the gravitational pull of a photograph of a fun fair that no longer existed, carried in a front pocket for 10 years, Zorion began to escalate. The seawall cracked, a precise controlled fracture, a demonstration for force. The campervan in the car park rose 18 inches off the ground, rotated 45 degrees, settled back down. The sand in a 20-meter radius began to vibrate at a frequency that made all three of them feel briefly, overwhelmingly nauseated. These were, Nadia understood, not threats. They were queries. What do you value enough to protect? Show me what you will act to preserve, and I will know what you are. George put his hand on the camper van roof. He wasn't trying to hold it down. It was already back on the ground. He just put his hand on it and said to no one in particular, "My daughter's dress is in there. For the wedding." That was it. That was his entire statement of value. Kenji reached into his jacket pocket and found, without looking, a small folded piece of paper. He opened it. Ship's manifest 20 years old, in handwriting that wasn't his. He looked at it for a moment, then folded it back up. Nadia kept holding the photograph. Went still. Not motionless. Its surface was always doing something, always processing, but there was a quality to its stillness that she later described to the researchers as confusion. And they told her she was projecting anthropomorphism, and she told them they were welcome to stand on a cold beach in November with their hand out and see if they had a better word for it. She had a theory forming. She didn't know if it was right. But she had spent 12 years as a care worker, which meant She had spent 12 years reading people who couldn't always communicate directly, people with dementia, people with late-stage illness, people whose relationship to the world had shifted in ways that language couldn't catch up to, and she had learned that the question was never, "What are you saying?" The question was always, "What are you trying to find out?" Zorion was trying to find out if they could be predicted, if their behavior could be modeled, if their responses were consistent and therefore manageable. And the answer, she realized, was no, not because humans were chaotic, but because human value was indexed to things that only existed in the human who held them. You couldn't predict what a person would protect without knowing the specific interior history that made that thing matter. And you couldn't access that interior history from the outside because it wasn't stored anywhere outside. It was the species' only real encryption, and they'd developed it without knowing they had it. She lowered the photograph. She made eye contact with Kenji. "It's trying to assess us," she said. "I know," he said. "It can't." He considered this because of the photo, because of everything like the photo, everything we carry that isn't in the object. George had been listening. He said, "So what do we do?" Nadia thought about this for approximately 4 seconds. Then she said, "Don't explain it. Whatever you do, don't explain why it matters. Just act like it matters. Like it always has. Like the reason is obvious." She turned back toward Zorion and did something she hadn't planned and couldn't entirely explain afterward. She walked forward 6 paces across the wet sand, stopped, and put the photograph away in her pocket. Then she sat down on the sand, cross-legged, facing the sea, her back to the alien. She wasn't ignoring it. She was doing something far stranger from its perspective. She was giving her attention to something that wasn't there. The sea, the horizon, the memory of a funfair, a woman laughing. None of these things were present. She was present and elsewhere simultaneously, in a way that its instruments could not pass. Kenji sat down beside her, a foot of cold sand between them. He opened his thermos and poured 2 cups and handed her one without looking at her. George, after a moment, sat down on her other side and put the world's okayest grandad mug on the sand in front of him with the same careful precision you'd use setting down something irreplaceable. The 3 of them sat with their backs to Zor and faced the gray November sea. The pressure in the air changed again, several times. There were sounds, deep subsonic, that Nadia felt in her ribcage rather than heard. She didn't turn around. Beside her, Kenji poured tea that was now half cold and drank it with the same equanimity he would have brought to a hot cup. George muttered something that she later learned was, "Come on then, lass," directed at nobody, which was what he said under his breath at every difficult thing in his life, a habit he'd developed when his wife was sick, and kept because stopping had never seemed necessary. Half an hour passed. Nadia knew this because she checked her watch, and she was going to be late for her shift, and she was already composing the explanation she was going to give her manager. Then Zorion did something new. It moved to the edge of its original position and stopped. It did not approach them. It stayed where it was, and its sensory apparatus swept the beach once more. And then it went through what Nadia could only describe as a kind of recalibration, a settling, a shift, the way a person looks when they've been handed an answer that doesn't match the question they thought they were asking. It had come here to read them, to catalog them, to build a model that would tell it what kind of response to prepare. Instead, it had found a species whose value system was stored in the gap between objects and the people who remembered why those objects mattered, in the space between a photograph and a dead woman's laugh, between a ship's manifest and 30 years of a life, between a stupid mug and a daughter's wedding dress on the other side of a car park. It couldn't read that. It had never failed to read anything. It left, not dramatically. The seam in the object opened again. The light retracted. The object moved back across the wet sand with the same unhurried quality of its arrival, slipped beneath the surface 20 meters out, and was gone. The sea filled in the space it had left. The tide was still going out. Nadia sat there for another minute. Then she stood up, brushed wet sand off her trousers, and called her manager. She explained that she'd been delayed at the seafront by an unforeseen situation. Her manager, who had known Nadia for 8 years and had learned that unforeseen situation was Nadia's phrase for everything from a dog attack to a burst water main, said fine, she'd cover the first hour, don't make a habit of it. Kenji capped his thermos and stood. George picked up his mug and looked at it for a moment. Still warm, he said, faintly surprised. He drank the rest of it. They didn't exchange numbers. They didn't make plans to meet. What had happened was too large for immediate processing and too personal for the kind of rapid bonding that movies suggested should follow extraordinary events. They were strangers who had shared something they didn't have language for yet, on a beach that most of England didn't know existed. George's campervan started first try. He drove north to Edinburgh and arrived 3 hours late, and his daughter hugged him so hard he nearly dropped the bouquet. He'd stopped for somewhere outside Newcastle, and he didn't tell her what had happened on the beach. Not that night, not at the reception, not for 3 months. When he did tell her, she looked at him for a long time and said, "So it couldn't figure us out?" And he said no, and she said, "Good," and they left it there. Kenji walked home along the promenade with his thermos and his waterproof and his physio-mandated steps, and that night he wrote 2 pages in the notebook he kept for things he wanted to think about further, and the next morning he read them back and crossed most of it out because he'd overcomplicated it. What was left was, they stored their value in us. We stored ours somewhere they couldn't reach. That's it. That's the whole thing. Nadia worked the 4 to midnight shift. There was a man on the ward who was 91 and had been mostly nonverbal for 2 years, and that night he reached out and held her wrist when she came to check on him, not tightly, just held it, and looked at her with the particular look of someone who is trying to give something to someone. And she held his hand back, and they stayed like that for a while, and she thought about the photograph in her pocket and the gap between the object and the thing the object meant, and she thought, we have always lived here, in the space that can't be read. We built our whole civilization in the place where the instruments can't reach. There was a 4th person, briefly. A teenage boy, maybe 16, maybe 17, had been sitting on the promenade wall behind them for the last 40 minutes, headphones around his neck, bicycle leaning against the rail. He had his phone out, but he wasn't filming. He'd tried twice, and both times the screen had gone dark. Not from the electromagnetic interference, which had stopped being selective about electronics about 10 minutes in, but because something in him had decided that filming it was wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. He sat with his phone face down on the concrete and watched. Nadia had clocked him early. She noticed people at thresholds, in doorways, at the edges of rooms as a professional habit. She'd spent enough time on night shifts to know that the person hanging back was often the one who needed the most. When Zorion's sensory apparatus swept toward the promenade for the 3rd time, a long, slow pan that felt to Nadia like being read, like being turned over and held up to a light. She heard the boy behind them say, very quietly to himself, "It's trying to figure out which one of us is in charge." She turned around. He was watching the alien with the focused lateral attention of someone who had spent a lot of time studying things that moved unpredictably, and she recognized that attention because it was the same attention she used at work, the same scanning qualities she'd developed over years of reading rooms where the usual cues didn't apply. "You're right," she said. He looked at her. He had the particular guarded expression of a teenager who has said something out loud and isn't sure if they're about to be embarrassed for it. "It's a survey tool," she said. "It reads hierarchies. It's trying to establish who gives orders and who follows them. Because if it can identify leadership, it can target it," the boy said. "And you're not showing it one. None of us are." He got off the wall and came down the steps to the sand, hands in his jacket pockets, and stood a little apart from the 3 of them, which was not quite joining them and not quite staying separate. After a moment he sat down on the sand too, which made 4 of them, and Nadia thought about the geometry of this. 4 strangers on a beach in November, sitting with their backs to something that had catalogued 1,000 species and never failed to read one, and what the formation suggested to an intelligence looking for the apex node. Nothing. No hierarchy, just 4 people on a beach. She asked him what his name was. Matty, he said. Why aren't you filming it? He thought about this. Doesn't feel like mine to film, he said eventually. Does that make sense? It made complete sense. It was, she thought, the most precisely articulated description of the privacy of interiority she had heard in some time. The escalation came in waves. After the campervan, Zorian turned its attention to the seawall text, which had already rearranged once. This time, it didn't rearrange the letters. It seemed to grasp that the content was arbitrary, but instead attempted something more sophisticated. The wall began to radiate a low-frequency sound that carried, embedded in it, what felt like a question. Not language. Closer to music, or to the feeling of music, something that pressed at the places in the skull where memories were stored and tugged at them, gently, like trying to read someone's notes over their shoulder. Kenji felt it first. That's not noise, he said, in the careful tone of someone describing a mechanical fault. No, Nadia agreed. It's trying to make us surface something. Show it what's in there. George put both hands around his mug. My daughter's name is Rachel, he said, to no one, to all of them, to the air. She's getting married Saturday. I've not met the bloke in person yet, just video calls, but he makes her laugh the way her mum used to make her laugh, which is, that's the thing, isn't it? That's the test. He paused. Anyway, the sound stopped. Not tapered off, stopped. Clean, as if the sentence had caused a short circuit in the process. Nadia understood why. The sentence was a closed loop that couldn't be entered from the outside. A man who had never met his future son-in-law knew already that he was the right person for his daughter, based on the specific quality of her laughter compared to the specific quality of his dead wife's laughter, 2 sounds that existed now nowhere in the physical world, only in a nervous system. The evaluation had no inputs that could be read from the exterior. It was a verdict rendered entirely in the interior. You could not replicate that logic with any instrument. You could not model it without having been the man holding the mug. The sound tried 3 more times in quick succession, each time finding a different frequency, something that felt like fear, then something that felt like pride, then something that felt briefly and disorienting, like nothing so much as homesickness, and each time one of the 4 of them responded to it in a way that was entirely specific to their interior history. Kenji described the ship he'd been on, got the news his father had died. Matty said the name of a school he'd hated, and then, after a pause, the name of the teacher who'd made it bearable. Nadia said nothing, but she pressed her hand flat against her coat pocket where the photograph was, and that was enough. The sound stopped trying. The official response came 11 days later when the electromagnetic anomaly data and the sand placement patterns and the thermal imaging from a passing Coast Guard helicopter finally aggregated into something that someone at UXA couldn't explain and escalated. There were people in Nadia's living room with lanyards and laptops who asked her to describe what had happened in as much detail as she could remember. She described it as accurately as she could. When she got to the part about the photograph, one of the people with lanyards, young, earnest, the kind of serious that hadn't had the edges worn off it yet, leaned forward and said, "So you created a paradox in its data model. You showed it a value that couldn't be accessed or reproduced from the object itself, essentially a dead reference. It couldn't close the loop." Nadia said, "I was showing it a picture of my mum." He wrote that down. She wasn't sure why. Later, alone in her kitchen with a cup of tea, she looked at the photograph again, the funfair. Her mother's laugh preserved in silver halide and cheap laminate. 20 years on from a beach visit and 30 years from her mother's last breath, and it still had weight, still pulled at something behind her sternum with the patient gravity of a thing that hadn't finished mattering yet. She thought about Zokrion, out there somewhere beyond the continental shelf, processing the failure, turning over its instruments and checking them, running diagnostics, trying to understand what had gone wrong with its centuries-long methodology. She thought, "You built something that reads surfaces. We are not surfaces. We never have been." She put the photograph back in her pocket, where it lived, where it would keep living, in the space between what a thing is, and what a thing means to the person carrying it. The space that had, apparently, without any of them knowing, been humanity's most impenetrable fortress all along. Matty, it turned out, was a child of a military family, which was why he could read hierarchies in a room before he could read cursive. He'd been moved around enough that he had learned to assess any new environment within minutes. Who held authority, who resented it, what the unspoken rules were, what you could and couldn't say. He was, in this narrow sense, the most tactically literate person on the beach. He just had no way of knowing, until afterward, that this was the skill that had mattered. He came back 6 weeks later and walked the beach for an hour, alone, and then he sat on the promenade wall, where he'd sat that morning and tried to work out what had happened to him. Not to the world. The world's processing of the event was already beginning, in classified reports and hushed briefings and conversations in rooms with no windows. What had happened to him specifically in the 40 minutes he'd sat on cold concrete watching something from another star system fail to figure out what he was. He'd felt in those 40 minutes genuinely unreadable for the first time in his life. He'd spent 16 years being read, by teachers looking for the disruptive kid, by other kids looking for the weird one, by his dad's colleagues looking for the officer's son who might embarrass the family, by every new school that had access to his file and had already decided what kind of student he was before he sat down. And on a beach in November, with an alien instrument scanning the coast, he'd sat and said the name of a teacher and been entirely impenetrable. It was. He wrote in a sixth form essay the following spring, in response to a prompt about a formative experience which was the understatement of the decade. Quite something. The essay won a prize. He didn't tell the judges why he'd written it. The tide was still going out. It always was on that coast. But it always came back, and it brought with it the same grey water over the same grey sand, and on clear days you could see the horizon from the promenade wall, and nothing that came from beyond that horizon had managed yet to read what 4 ordinary people kept in the place between its object and its meaning. Not for lack of trying, just for lack of the right instrument, which as far as anyone could tell didn't exist.